The only terror flapping in the night around these parts is the dog's tail wagging frantically at 3 in the morning, moaning for a chance to run around the yard and bark at the neighbors late at night. Not even Drake Mallard wants anything to do with that piece of business. Well, it's time to get dangerous. Again, with Darkwing Duck, released in 1993 for Game Boy from Capcom, which is more or less a straight conversion of the NES game that we looked at last year. And since next week we're going to be looking at the rest of those Disney afternoon games, the NES ones, Goof Troop and Bonkers will have to wait another year, only makes sense to cover the Game Boy version of Darkwing, which is pretty much the same game, except not as good, which is to be expected. But here's a fun fact. Did you know that Nintendo Power once named Darkwing Duck the third best Game Boy title of 1993? Right behind Mega Man 4 with Link's Awakening ruling the roost. So with that kind of company, you know it's gotta be good, right? Well, hold on there, pal, because rounding out the list are Kirby's Pinball Land and Rampart at number 4. And you know, I gotta wonder, in what universe does anyone with anything resembling half-functioning brain matter would consider anything involving Kirby, even a side game, a lesser title than bloody Rampart? Well, now it's no wonder why Kirby's always angry on those American covers. The poor bastard never got over that slight. But anyway, back to Darkwing on Game Boy. So as you would expect, things are running afoul in St. Canard and it's up to Darkwing Duck to save the day. You start off on a stage select screen where you get to pick one of 3 stages on screen, each accompanied by a quick blurb from Launchpad to explain the situation and confirmation before beginning a stage. Clear the first 3 stages, another 3 pop up, and then it's off the Steelbeak's luxury liner, giving you 7 stages of fairly standard side-scrolling fare that play similarly to Capcom's other notable franchise from around this time. You know, the one they'll sometimes pretend to care about every few years before forgetting about him again. Darkwing starts off with a standard gas gun. A gas gun that doesn't pass through solid matter, which is fine until you face off against foes whose projectiles have no such restriction, fuck them. But along the way you can pick up one of 3 other gas weapons: Thunder Gas, which fires 2 shots diagonally, Heavy Gas, which drops a heavy load on the ground that shoots 2 ways, and finally Arrow Gas, which shoots an arrow that you can stick to walls and use as temporary platforms. You can only carry one special gas gun at a time and they require ammunition, but you can swap between that and your normal gun whenever with the press of the select button. Beyond that, Darkwing's skill set is fairly basic. He can run, jump, shoot left or right, and crouch, standard fare. He could also hang on to certain platforms or hooks, which is useful for reaching higher ground or evading traps. And by pressing up on the D-pad, he could use his cape to block most projectiles, a fairly useful ability in fending off some of the more fiendish fiends. Some enemies will drop items when defeated, such as loots for points, hearts for health, and sometimes even a 1-up. So much like the console version this is based on, what you have with Darkwing Duck is an action game that unquestionably plays similarly to a certain Blue Bomber, although not quite as slick or smooth, but still adequate enough to get things done. The challenge mostly comes from overcoming enemy attacks as well as traversing certain obstacles with some finicky controls that tend to not be as responsive as the NES version, particularly with the grabbing, but otherwise no worse for wear. The Game Boy version, for the most part, does a fine enough job of condensing the NES levels to the smaller screen, with some obvious compromises made to fit the lesser resolution. Now this naturally affects the boss fights, which gives you less room to maneuver in most cases, but on the other hand though... Oh, poor Moriarty. That mole got boned hard. Anyway, moving on. In terms of replicating the graphical assets of the NES version, Darkwing on Game Boy does a fairly good job of it. Obviously, there's the condensing of assets such as sprites and tiles to make everything fit the screen while being big enough to be easily distinguishable, but for the most part I think they succeeded. Sprites look nearly accurate, the backgrounds are pretty well done, even in a monochrome state. It's not like it's a super intense visual feast or anything. The most graphically intense thing in this game is probably the intro, for whatever that's worth. The only real knock against the game is the occasional slowdown that hits, but you sorta expect that with these Game Boy conversions. Everything else looks nearly spot on, no complaints on the graphical front, as far as I'm concerned. And yes, it's another Capcom title on Game Boy with solid conversions of some top-notch NES chip music recreated almost note for note, with the only real giveaway being the instruments used to produce those sounds. Naturally, the Game Boy sounds less punchier than the NES versions, but still pretty good all things considered. Sound effects, on the other hand, a little on the weaker side, but again, sort of expected here. Overall, Darkwing Duck on Game Boy is a fairly respectable part of the NES game, with a couple issues that hold it back from one-to-one perfection, but still a fun enough ride on its own. And look, Darkwing Duck is a good Mega Man-like game that plays exceptionally well, honestly one of the better Disney-Capcom collaborations to come out of that era, and that still holds true for the Game Boy version despite those couple minor blemishes. All in all, still a fine game even in this compromised state, and one of numerous examples of Game Boy conversions of NES games actually turning out alright. Now if you want the opposite side of that coin, that's coming up on Friday, but first we've got a digression of sorts. And no, it's not Darkwing Duck on TurboGrafx 16. Look, I'll save you the trouble. It sucks. There, we're done. Fuck off. Moving on. Next.